Hallie Jackson with a breaking news special report. Donald Trump on trial and a stunning close to the day. The judge clearing the courtroom after getting sass from a new witness for the defense. We're talking about Robert Costello giving attitude on the stand, muttering, calling it ridiculous. At one point saying, geez, to the judge, who was like, stop, no. The press had to leave. So did almost everybody else, except for Mr. Trump's entourage of loyalists in the first couple rows. After what was presumably a dressing down, the judge let folks back in, and Costello, who seemed a bit chagrined at that point, carried on with his testimony. Now, remember why Costello matters here. He was the former legal advisor for the prosecution's star witness, Michael Cohen, who has said he can prove Cohen is lying. Costello just wrapped up getting cross-examined by the prosecution. He's going to be back on the stand tomorrow morning after a different cross-examination, a highly anticipated one. The defense team going after Cohen himself with a bunch of attempts to try to chip away at Cohen's credibility. Like another pretty extraordinary moment in court with Cohen acknowledging he stole something like $30,000 from the Trump organization, or saying that maybe he wants to run for Congress, or even possibly write a third book about the former president. This cross-examination seemed to drag, with our team in the courtroom reporting the jurors seemed less than compelled, rubbing their eyes, head in hands, shifting around in their seats. One thing that never came up, that 2017 meeting at the Oval Office, the prosecutors say is at the heart of the 34 felony counts Mr. Trump pleaded not guilty to for allegedly falsifying business records. So that is where things stand at the moment. It's possible that any second we could see Donald Trump walk out of court. It has not yet quite wrapped for the day, even though jurors are gone. And it's possible we could be in court for days longer, because now closing arguments, they're not going to be tomorrow like we thought last week. Instead, they're going to be next Tuesday, a week from tomorrow, meaning at this moment, the 2 days of the trial this week are a big TBD. For the next 20 minutes, we're taking you inside all the rooms cameras could not be in for every key element coming out of court, what it means, why it matters, and maybe most importantly now, what's coming next. We've got our team of reporters and legal and political experts here to break it all down. Let's start with Vaughn Hilliard, who is live for us outside the courthouse. It is a news cliche to call them fireworks, Vaughn, but that's what they are, figuratively, of course, inside court today. Help us understand what went down with this defense witness, Robert Costello, and why it matters.
Right. It's notable because Robert Costello is their really one notable witness that the defense for Donald Trump chose to call here today. And within a matter of minutes, he was forcefully rebuked by the judge in front of the jury. It led to the jury and the press being asked to go out of the room. But before that took place, there were very direct remarks from Judge Merchan to Robert Costello, that witness who was a legal advisor to Michael Cohen, in part saying that I'd like to discuss proper decorum in my courtroom. If you don't like my ruling, you don't say, geez, you don't give me side eye, and you don't roll your eyes. Clear the courtroom. Again, these were very explicit messages that were being sent from Judge Merchan to Robert Costello. And ultimately, after a few minutes upon being re-entering the courtroom, the testimony from Robert Costello came to an end. He testified that Michael Cohen had told him back in 2018 that he had done this all by himself, the Stormy Daniels payment, and that Donald Trump did not direct him to do it. But under cross-examination, there were further questions that would have suggested that perhaps Michael Cohen was not being, fully honest with Robert Costello at the time, because those conversations came just a matter of weeks before he ended up working with federal investigators and playing guilty in admitting to crimes that he says he committed.
There was this moment today, and we were waiting to see what would happen with Michael Cohen's testimony, the finishing up, if you will, of this cross-examination. There was some back and forth that happened, not in front of the jurors, over the C-SPAN video from 2016. Should it be allowed into evidence? Should it not be? At one point, prosecutors were like, fine, we'll bring back a witness so that we can get this admitted into evidence. Why was this particular image that we're about to show so critical?
This had to do with conversations that Michael Cohen and Donald Trump had in October of 2016, around the time that the payment was being made to Stormy Daniels. And this particular video that you're looking at was the night of October 24th, 2016. And Michael Cohen had testified last week that he had a phone call about 5 minutes after this video was taken between him, and you'll see that guy in the red tie there, the bald man, that's Keith Schiller, his bodyguard at the time, and that he, in that phone call, was put on the line with Donald Trump, where he says Donald Trump told him to execute that $130,000 payment to Stormy Daniels. But then under cross-examination, Donald Trump's team called it into question, saying, well, we have text messages from around that same hour with Keith Schiller, in which you seem to want to talk to him related to a 14-year-old prank calling you. And Michael Cohen said, well, we talked about both of those things in that phone call. And this is where the prosecution brought this video evidence forward today, saying, look, this just 5 minutes before that phone call took place, you see Keith Schiller standing there on that stage with Donald Trump. The timing of it would make sense that Trump would have been with him when Michael Cohen placed that phone call.
Vaughn Hilliard live first there in downtown Manhattan. As we are looking now, this is a live look on the left side of your screen at the hallway. This is typically where we see the former president walk out. And Vaughn, one of the big questions is, what will he say, if anything, about the clearing of the court by the judge late today and about whether or not he will, in fact, take the stand? We know that one of his representatives has suggested he's wanted to. Other legal experts that we've spoken with have said if that happens, bad news potentially for the defense.
Right. One of his attorneys who is not working on this specific case, her name is Alina Hava.
Yeah.
She just this afternoon explicitly said that he should listen to the advice of his attorneys. And then the very next sentence says he wants to testify. So this gets at the heart of whether Donald Trump can be convinced that he shouldn't take the stand in his own defense. Because if he does, he subjects himself to hours and days of questioning from the prosecution, who would love it if he took the stand because they could ask him questions. Yet, you know, Donald Trump is somebody who in the past, in the E. Jean Carroll trial, chose not to take the stand, later wished that he had after he was found to have sexually assaulted her. He felt like he didn't have the chance to actually go and defend himself. And so the question here is for him, does he feel like in these public settings, when he leaves the courtroom and speaks in the hallway to cameras, is that enough of a platform for him to make his case? Or does he feel like come tomorrow, when he would need to be testifying, that he feels like he needs to do it under oath in front of the 12 jurors that are going to decide his fate?
Vaughn, thank you. As we keep an eye on this live picture now out of this camera inside the hallway in court, it is a familiar picture to all of you as we've been watching as court has been wrapping up for the day right here on NBC News Now during these special reports. I want to bring in a couple of attorneys who know Mr. Trump well. They defended him during his second impeachment trial. Michael Vanderveen and William Brennan, thanks to you both for being here. Appreciate it. As we keep an eye, of course, on what's happening in the hallway here. William, let me start with you. Should the former president's team be nervous about the way the judge just slammed Robert Costello here?
Well, it's been a long trial. Tensions rise. It's a cumulative thing. And, you know, it's not unusual, but I think it's just
it's really not unusual to clear the court because a witness is getting sassy?
Well, it's not unusual for tempers to. I'm surprised there wasn't more of it in this case, but it really, it's just a red herring. It's nothing to focus on.
Yeah.
The thing to focus on is a disbarred lawyer saying that he stole $60,000 from his client. That's the lead of the day. So
this is the acknowledgement that Michael Cohen made that we referenced here at the top of the broadcast. I think it came out after tax to be something like $30,000, one of several ways in which Mr. Trump's defense team tried to chip away at Michael Cohen's credibility. You know, Mr. Trump
charge after tax.
Is he happy with the way his defense team is handling this now that it is their turn to make the argument for why Mr. Trump should not be prosecuted?
Is Mr. Trump?
Yeah, I know you're not in his head, but based on what you know about him.
I think so. I did not talk to him over the weekend, but I'll tell you that when I saw him Thursday coming out of court, he thanked his lawyers. He said he's paying his lawyers, and you could tell he was happy.
I don't want to interrupt you, but I do want to pause for a moment because we are seeing Mr. Trump walk up to the microphone here in court in downtown Manhattan. We want to listen just for a second here to see what he has to say.
Thank you very much. You saw what we saw. That was an incredible display. I've never seen anything like it in my life. A tyrant. And everyone's talking about it. This is what we have. We have an acting judge, appointed judge by Democrats, by the club. And they're keeping now, I guess this is our fourth week, soon to be our fifth week. Not campaigning, but you saw what happened, what just took place in that court. And hopefully the motion to dismiss this trial will go through, because this trial is a disaster for our country. It's a disaster for New York State, New York City. Greg Jarrett just says, where exactly is the crime?
All right, so there's former President Trump speaking outside court, as he has done now pretty frequently, I think almost daily since this trial began here, referencing what happened in court, the judge clearing the room, calling it something he'd never seen before, although William may make the point, sometimes this happens. Sometimes tempers flare and you need to take a beat to reset for a bit.
We spent 8 weeks in that actual courtroom in front of Judge Merchan, and I think other than at the very end, there was a minor little thing that didn't clear the courtroom. But I mean, that's what happens.
Yeah.
People get tired. It's an emotionally and physically draining experience. And it sounded like, I mean, we're just listening like everybody else, but it sounded like the witness got a little flip. Any witness, it's not about the witness, it's about the case.
Yeah.
I think the real takeaway here is that the jurors are watching the interaction between the judge and the witness.
Although they weren't present when he dressed him down.
No, but he dressed him down because of what the witness was doing to him in front of the jury.
That's right.
Jeez
and ridiculous and all
showing him
this, right.
disrespect. And what people need to understand is the jury respects the judge. The jury likes the judge. All juries like the judge. And our experience is the jury's really like Juan Merchan. He's professional. He's courteous. He is what you expect to see sitting up at the top of a bench in a black robe.
He's Spielberg's version of the judge.
So you're saying he's out of central casting?
He's out of central casting. Yeah. I'm not talking about rulings, political beliefs. I don't know anything about that. But I know that in general, jurors like and respect judges. It's kind of like a father figure. And this guy in particular really has a lot of charisma, and they like him. So taking the judge on in his own courtroom, not a good idea when you're a witness.
Let me ask you both, given the fact that you have argued cases on behalf of former President Trump, William, to you, if he wants to testify, if he really wanted to testify, do you think that Todd Blanche could convince him otherwise, given the very clear and obvious risks?
Blanche looks like he played rugby, or Blanche looks like maybe he can get him in a half Nelson, but he's got to keep him off that stand. They got to duct tape him in a chair somewhere because Blanche has done a phenomenal job on this cross. I mean, talk about a guy that paces himself. I thought he buried the lead when he brought out the fact that the call was really about a 14-year-old child that this lunatic wanted the Secret Service
So
with.
this is this 96-second phone call that's at the heart of some of the cross-examination.
I thought that was a knockout punch. And then today he comes out with stealing, whether it's $60,000 or $30,000. In the world of attorney discipline, stealing from a client is like first-degree murder. It's the worst thing you can do.
Although,
and now he wants to run for, well, he might qualify for Congress.
There is a question about whether or not the sort of length of the cross-examination kept the jury engaged, frankly, because some of our team in the courtroom suggested they saw, listen, it's a long day. It's a long day for the jury. They were sort of shifting in their seats, their head in their hands, they're rubbing their faces.
It was a long couple days, actually.
That's right.
It's 2+ days of cross-examination. But there was another week you could have gone with a guy. You've really got to be in Blanche's position and say, I got to hit these points, and that takes time.
And Al, there's this whole narrative that Cohen's trying to sell, and apparently Hoffinger's buying into it because on the cross of this witness, Costello, she said, "Would you have empathy for a poor man whose apartment was raided?" I mean, this nonsense that Cohen's telling about it, what he did to my family. No, who says that? Somebody whose family is rear-ended by a drunk driver, or somebody whose home is broken into. He did these actions himself, and he can't blame anybody. The man in the moon, the dog ate his homework. He did them himself.
It's going to be up to a jury to decide, not any of us sitting around this table.
True.
And that jury decision is likely now not going to come until at least next week, if not longer. Do you think that this delay now until Tuesday works in Mr. Trump's favor here? The judge made the point, there's going to be a break. We got Memorial Day. He's basically saying the calendar is the calendar. So he doesn't want to start closings until the jury will have some time all in a row to deliberate.
Hallie, it's really too early to answer that question because there's more defense coming. I think they will put on an expert witness from the FEC. I think there's a chance, and I know a lot of people disagree with me, I think there's a good chance he's testifying.
A good chance?
A good chance.
Did Donald Trump testify? A good chance?
He's gnawing at the bit to testify. He has the experience of regretting once that he didn't testify. And in retrials, when you don't do that, you do testify
I agree
the
with
next
Mike.
time.
I wouldn't write them off.
All right.
I wouldn't write them off
William
at all.
Brennan, Michael Vanderveen, I know you both have a busy afternoon. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks
We're going to
for having
save
me.
this tape. We're going to clip it and roll it back next week when we see. Thank you both very much.
Thank you for
I want to
having
get to our NBC News legal analysts, Danny Savalos and Catherine Christian. So you just heard the conversation here from two attorneys who know Mr. Trump well. Danny, I want to pick up on that thread with you. Do you think that the defense was effective in the cross-examination today of Michael Cohen and in bringing Robert Costello forward?
Oh, the Philly accents are thick today, Hallie, with Bill Brennan.
I didn't know Savalas was going to be on there.
Bill Brennan and the V is on. Oh, my goodness. Listen, they made a lot of good points. And, you know, here in this case, hello, gentlemen.
Hello, Danny.
The defense, you know, really, I don't think there's too much to worry about in the sense that, look,
What do you mean?
I think it's a bigger deal that they probably, if they were just going to call Costello, and we don't really know that he's the last witness, maybe just rest and then go with the whole reasonable doubt, didn't prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, presumption of innocence. I wonder if calling Costello, if that's really their only point, if it's just such a minor point that, and I want to be clear here, the burden of proof never shifts to the defense, but whether or not they created the specter of the burden shifting to them in the sense that they're undertaking to prove something, where they have the burden to prove nothing, 0.0. They have no burden whatsoever. So I wonder if maybe, look, by the way, I'm not criticizing that choice. You got to make choices at trial. They're tough choices. It's easy for me to sit here in this air-conditioned studio and say, hey, that was a bad call. But, you know, maybe not call Costello, maybe do call Costello. So far, it's not going well because of the way Costello is testifying. But look, you take chances during trial. Sometimes they work. Sometimes they maybe don't go as smoothly as you had hoped.
Before Cohen left, and we understand he is now back home at his apartment in New York, he did not speak or engage with reporters on his way out of court or into his home, Catherine. But I wonder, you heard Mr. Trump's attorneys in different cases talk about the way that the prosecution tried to perhaps elicit some sympathy for Michael Cohen, especially in the redirect there. He acknowledged that his life, he feels, Cohen said, has been made immeasurably more difficult because of what he has gone through with former President Trump. Is that an effective strategy?
It's an effective strategy. Quite frankly, I don't think the jurors are going to be sympathetic to Michael Cohen. The question for the prosecutors are, will they believe him? So for that part of his testimony that has not been corroborated, he has to be believed. I don't think anyone is going to be feeling sorry for him. He's a liar, he's a thief, but the argument is that's who Donald Trump wanted. That's who worked in the Donald Trump world. So I thought the redirect was effective in that it rehabilitated Mr. Cohen from last Thursday when the defense thought they caught him in a lie. And I think that the prosecutors have established for the jury, well, he wasn't lying. He talked to Donald Trump about Stormy Daniels a number of times. He spoke to him a number of times. So he was just mistaken.
And yet, Danny, and forgive me for asking a remarkably obvious question here, but why wouldn't the defense ask about that critical meeting in the Oval Office, something that the prosecution has pointed to as a linchpin to the heart of this matter, this so-called hush money payment and whether Mr. Trump knew what the money was going for?
So generally speaking, on cross, you're not going to ask a question that either you're not going to make any headway on or that the witness can throw back in your face and maybe do more damage. It's not a question of they just forgot about these facts or forgot about that meeting. The defense is so immersed in these facts, they've forgotten more about this case than we'll ever know. That's what happens when you're on trial. So they know about it. They made a conscious decision not to go into that. And my guess is that it was a strategic one, thinking that, look, this is the kind of thing that if we ask him about, he's going to double down. By the way, they asked a lot of questions that Cohen did double down on, even when he may have had spotty memory. So my guess is that they avoided this because they just didn't think they'd be able to make any headway on it, or they felt that the prosecution didn't establish that conversation, although that seems a little unlikely to me because that evidence did come in and it was unrebutted. So, I mean, it really comes down to a strategic choice. By no means, there's no way they just forgot.
So, Catherine, that's that Oval Office meeting at the heart of the matter in these charges against former President Trump in this historic criminal trial. The spicy moments that we saw at the end of court today perhaps don't get to the heart of the matter in such a degree, but former President Trump did address them in the hallway just a couple of minutes ago, and he said something. He said the press got thrown out. I imagine they're not very happy. That is true, right? I mean, typically losing access to a courtroom at a moment of historical importance is critical. Interestingly, though, Catherine, former President Trump's, call them entourage, some of his supporters who showed up to sit in the first couple of rows were not cleared from court. Is that unusual for some of the courtroom to be cleared, not all of it? What does that say to you about this moment?
Well, typically you don't clear out people who are there for the defense. So defendant's family, defendant's friends. I'm not sure why Judge Merchan cleared the courtroom. He was on the record chastising the defense witness, Mr. Costello, who was acting for a lawyer, acting outrageous on the stand, being disrespectful to the judge. But typically you wouldn't get rid of who the defendant has brought into the courtroom.
Catherine Christian, Danny Savalos, another interesting day in court as we barrel towards potentially a finish as early as next week. Thank you both very much for being with us. I want to bring in now our team who has covered Mr. Trump extensively to get into some of the rest of what's at play here, including the politics. New York Times investigative reporter David Fahrenthold, Wall Street Journal senior political correspondent Molly Ball, and NBC News chief political analyst Chuck Todd. Chuck, since we are here in your building, the house that Chuck built, talk to me about how you see Robert Costello as a witness here, somebody who's come forward who perhaps, clearly isn't a fan of Michael Cohen, clearly isn't a fan of some of the other players in this case here. Talk me through your takeaways.
Look, it's an interesting, it feels like, look, I don't want to get into putting Trump on the couch, but it almost feels like the lawyer said, okay, they want to have somebody who can be tough on behalf, perhaps, and you almost have that feeling that this was done in some ways to appease the client a little bit, to fight back. But
because Donald Trump likes the optics of an attorney who will fight on his behalf.
He wants a fighter on this front. Look, I think we all know if he could testify without being cross-examined, he'd be testifying. But he's been in enough depositions to know.
Cross-examination comes with the territory.
Of course it does. And it probably doesn't help his case. But I bet it would be good politics for him to testify. So that is one thing I'm wondering, is how much Trump is calculating what is good politics versus what is good legal strategy, because it may not be the same thing.
Do you agree? I mean, we heard from some of the former president's former attorneys in a separate case that there's maybe a good chance he could testify. Good chance?
I don't know if it's good chance because look, I would not be shocked if he testified, because there's an arrogance to him that believes he can handle anything. And he doesn't have people around him that tell him no very often on that front. But, there is also moments where he seems to get the moment, if he thinks that puts him in more personal jeopardy, then I think he won't do it. But my guess is the way to talk him out of it and say, do you want to end up in jail? That's the way to keep him out of it, that if you don't testify now, you probably have a better shot at getting the conviction thrown out. That's the legal advice he's being given. I just think the political instinct in him,
the pull,
is to testify and fight.
I see you nodding, Molly.
Well, I think the bottom line here is that he does not want to be convicted. That's it. And period, end of story. And he can bluster all he wants about how the whole thing is a political witch hunt and he doesn't care one way or the other because he's never viewed it as legitimate and the prosecutor was out to get him. And we've heard that from him many, 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 many times. But he doesn't want to be convicted. And I think the legal consensus that it would put him in more jeopardy is pretty absolute, that it's not a good idea for the legal case for him to testify. And when it comes to making the political argument, he's doing that outside of court every day. He's doing it when he walks in and he's doing it when he walks out. And it gets on the news sometimes and it's out there on social media. And now the thing that has surprised me most about this trial is the backup that he's getting from so many Republican lawmakers and other allies who are going up there and helping him make the case. So he has been able to really set the political narrative in the media by making the case himself and having an entire political party back him up in the political case that he's making. So he doesn't have to testify to do that. But But you know, it's absolutely true that, you know, he has political interests and legal interests here. And I think he's been very clever about sort of recognizing that from the beginning and taking great care to steer the political narrative at the same time as something completely different might be happening in the courtroom.
There have been many compelling moments in this trial. There have been some moments that are dry, and we can just say that, and we can just call it what it is. And for the jury, for these 12 New Yorkers who are going to ultimately decide the fate of this past and potentially future president, they've had to be in there following every minute of it. It can get weedsy, David. You are somebody who understands the weeds, who has been and lived in the weeds as it relates to former President Trump. What are your big takeaways at the moment here? What do you think the jury is thinking about right now? That's a speculative question, but you get what I'm saying.
Well, you have to think, are they thinking about the 34 counts of document falsification? So much of the trial and the testimony from Stormy Daniels and other people, even Costello's testimony, have been about other stuff and other places, the far more interesting things in places than the 34 counts at issue. So you wonder if they get in the room and think about, okay, what do we actually know about these charges we're supposed to be deciding about? And in some cases, the only documentary evidence or the only evidence about what happened and why it happened, remember why is really important to proving a felony in this case, comes from Michael Cohen. And so I do think all the effort that the defense has put into trying to impeach Cohen or trying to make him look like a liar, which certainly went to jail for lying, that's the most important thing that's going to matter here, right? To the actual outcome of this case, not Stormy Daniels or anything else. Do people believe Michael Cohen when he says, Donald Trump told me to do this and told me to lie about it. Here's why he told me to lie about it.
Is it striking to you that we are continuing to see now this sort of Republican roll call of people show up with former President Trump in court?
No, I don't think so. I don't think, you know, from Access Hollywood to now, I don't think I'm ever surprised when elected Republicans see a chance to help themselves by standing behind Donald Trump and being the first. I mean, just think about Chris Christie, right? If you're the first guy to do what nobody else will do and stand behind Trump in a situation where everybody else is running away, there's huge benefits for you. So
look what it got Chris Christie, David.
Well, I mean, it got him pretty far.
Sorry, Rick Scott thinks he's going to be Senate Republican leader.
Right.
He was the first one. He broke this ice.
That's right.
He started this. And, you know, some of it is for, look, as you know.
Just to your point, though, Chris Christie did end up running the transition. I mean, you're absolutely right that he got rewarded in the
He's been on the backside of the arc now, but
exactly.
the arc went up for him for a while.
But look, when it, you know, there is a part of this where he's, I think he sees these folks see an opportunity to essentially just gloss over because they've seen what happens when they don't stand by him. Because
he
if
remembers.
you don't stand by him, you get mowed over. But it's remarkable to me that you had to ask that question, are you surprised to see this? And that your answer is, well, no, not since Access Hollywood. I think it's an important, not since Access Hollywood. Are we living in the non-normal times or not? Like this should be weird. It is odd that American politicians are thumbing their nose at the rule of law so easily before we've heard from a jury, before we know the actual verdict. So it is, this part to me is really disconcerting, and yet we're all just like, emoji shrug, because this is our normal ever since the Access.
To that point, it's a pretty inside baseball group showing up today, right? I mean, it's Speaker Mike Johnson, who showed up last week. I think a lot of Americans, at least some of them, would know who he is. Bernie Kerik, I don't know, Alan Dershowitz, probably not.
I can't believe,
I'm
sorry, I saw Bernard Kerik out there. This is one of the most disgraced individuals in the history of federal government. I mean, what happened when he was nominated to the Department of Homeland Security. You talk to George W. Bush, and those people, it is a nightmare. They still blame Rudy Giuliani for that. You know, they got talked into that. One of the most embarrassing episodes of the second Bush term. And there he is out there with sort of this, serving as a character witness for Donald Trump. America in 2024.
It's a split screen, too, because you have President Biden, who's been out to a degree on the road. We saw him out this weekend. He was trying to make inroads with black voters. You have former President Trump complaining that he cannot campaign because he's tied to court. Court is obviously not happening every day, Molly, and we saw him, for example, this weekend in Dallas at the NRA convention as well. There is still an opportunity for him to get his message out, and as you point out, he has the chance to do that every single day at 5 o'clock p.m. or 4:30 or whatever.
Well, and I think he's actually been pretty effective at getting the message out that he wants people to hear both about the trial and to be able to keep campaigning, talking about, policy, talking about the election, talking about his personal grievances or Hannibal Lecter or whatever the heck is on his mind. But he still has, that ability to break through. And I do wonder if there isn't some angst on the Democratic side about the fact that they don't have any sort of counter narrative in place. And I know that, the president wants to be respectful of the independence of the justice system and not put further strain on the doubts that so many people already have about it. But what it means is, I think you see in the polls the needle sort of moving toward Trump's view of the case. More and more people viewing it as a political prosecution, and there's not any sort of counter narrative on the political side to make the opposite case.
Very quickly.
I just found this asymmetric warfare, right? This is something that we all had to deal with as journalists, right? He come and attack our dispositions, the legal system. It would be absurd if the prosecutors held their own dueling press conferences, right? But, sometimes prosecutors do that, but then it almost, then you're playing his game and you're helping to play it. Like, I watch what Fani Willis is doing. And I don't know if that's helping the cause, that she's almost out there campaigning for the legitimacy of her case to the point of like, well, why are you, it's uncomfortable when it looks like you have to campaign for something that's already been accused of being a politically motivated trial. It's just, this is where Trump's just shamelessness sometimes, that the system is an advantage.
Chuck Todd, Molly Ball, David Fairnthorpe. It's too bad we don't have anything to talk about these days, Thank you all so much for being with us. We'll do it all again tomorrow with our special coverage of Donald Trump's historic criminal trial. We've got a lot of other big headlines tonight, though. We're going to catch you up on all of it when we pick up our regular programming right after this break. We're coming on the air tonight with shockwaves rippling around the world. Grief and relief after Iran's president was killed in a helicopter crash. We're live in the region with more on the power vacuum and what this means for a region already on edge. Plus, the new pictures we're just getting in of the tornadoes devastating the middle of the country. We'll take you to Texas, where they're bracing for a dangerous heat wave with hundreds of thousands of people still without power. And Target cutting the cost of thousands of things it sells to try to lure you away from its competitors. So is this the start of a big box price war? Then the pressure to post messing with our heads, especially for a generation growing up entirely online. We'll explain how in our original later in the show. Hey, I'm Hallie, and we are starting tonight with the intense reaction all around the world to the death of the Iranian president in a helicopter crash. A mixture in some corners of both grief and relief, with many mourning the loss of President Ibrahim Raisi, but many others remembering him as a brutal leader who oversaw executions and crackdowns. You can see here anti-Iranian regime activists seeming to celebrate the news in London. Back here at home, the White House National Security Advisor called Raisi a man who had a lot of blood on his hands. Right now, the Iranian first vice president is serving as the acting president. That will be the case until the new election, which we're just learning will be at the end of June. Here's what we know right now about Raisi's death after so many questions yesterday. A technical failure is being blamed for the crash of that chopper he was on, with Iranian officials blaming thick fog and bad weather for the slow response. You can see some of that fog coming in here. President Raisi had been traveling with a government delegation that went to Azerbaijan for a ceremony for a dam that's right there along the border. There were 9 people on board, including Iran's foreign minister, who was also killed. There are no survivors. The deadly crash leaves Iran now without 2 influential leaders at a time of international tension. And some big questions remaining, specifically about the crash, how this will reverberate across the Middle East, where Iran has obviously influence, and what happens next in Iran, where Raisi was widely expected to take over as the country's next supreme leader. Keir Simmons is joining us now from the region. Keir, talk about the latest on what we know about the reaction inside and outside Iran and beyond.
Well, we've seen all day these pictures of that helicopter, the debris, the wreckage, and of course, what you really see in those pictures, Hallie, is the reason why the plane went down, the mountainous terrain, the fog, the reason why rescuers found it so difficult to get to the crash site, and frankly, to save President Raisi's life and the foreign minister's life and those others on that helicopter with him. So I mean, the search was desperate. And in fact, we hear tonight from the US, according to the US, that Iran even reached out to the US to ask for help, and that logistics meant that wasn't actually possible. That gives you a measure of just the desperation, the need to try and reach that site. So we've had that story, if you like, and then the question of the implications. And I think, talking to, we just spoke in the last few hours to someone close to the Iranian government in Tehran, painting a picture of stability, but also just checking in with governments here in the Gulf, officials. They too assessing that the Iranian system is solid, if you like. I mean, clearly it's brutal for many, but solid, and therefore is going to weather this. And saying that potentially the implications for the region, both internally in Iran, in terms of its foreign policy, adversarial towards Israel and towards the US, for example, that isn't going to change. Longer term, Hallie, I think is a different question. But short term, elections, as you say, and I think business as usual, if you want to put it that way, for Iran.
Akira, I do wonder, too, just going back to some of those pictures you were talking about, some of the images, and we're seeing some of them here of that really thick fog, the situation of what it looked like, is perhaps part of the reason why there is not some sort of perhaps blame game that's happening now about the crash of this helicopter, which maybe without this fog, without these conditions, would be happening here. I don't want to get too speculative, but I do think that given the moment, given this region on edge, that was, 12 hours ago could have been a question mark.
Doesn't look like there is a blame game. Not really. I mean, a former Iranian foreign minister is saying the US is to blame because of sanctions that have inhibited Iran's air industry. I think, look at the internal politics in Iran if you want to know whether or not Iran starts blaming others, because that's the classic, kind of MO, if you like. When things start to look unstable internally, turn externally and point the finger. So that doesn't appear to be happening. And it's only 2 years ago, remember, that there were mass protests for women's rights after the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, who died after not covering herself the way that she was supposed to under religious law in Iran. Allegedly supposed to, I mean, this is a place where people are crushed, protests are crushed, and you mentioned those celebrations outside some embassies. Well, I mean, inside Iran, you can bet that there are those who would like to see change while they are not able to say it.
Keir Simmons, live for us tonight from Dubai. Keir, after, I know, a very intense 24 hours covering this international breaking story. Appreciate it. Back here at home tonight, millions of people are in the path of some pretty severe storms, some pretty intense storms that are barreling through the Midwest. We're already seeing right now tornadoes and some hail hitting states like Oklahoma and Kansas. Take a look. Overnight, that same system knocked out power, brought down trees. We saw search and rescue operations on the ground. At least 2 people were hurt. And you can see it here. Houses damaged, about 24 of them. The roof of a local firehouse totally blown off. All in all, this is 4 straight days of storms stretching from the plains to the East Coast this week, as another part of the country scrambles to recover from a system we told you about last week. 200,000 people still in the dark in Texas. That's where we find our Priscilla Thompson now. And Priscilla, with hundreds of thousands of people without power, this potentially very dangerous heat wave that's on the way comes at the worst possible time.
Yeah, Hallie, and the heat wave is already here. It is 90 degrees outside right now as we speak. I spoke to one woman who is still without power, and I asked her, what's it like in your house? And she said, it's like opening the oven at 350 degrees and just having that heat hit you in the face. And so officials here have been trying to pass out water and ice. We were over at a food distribution site earlier today where within less than 2 hours, they ran out of food. They had enough food for 500 people, and they were completely out. And I asked the organizer there what that says to her, and I want to play what she had to say.
I think that this experience really shows us time and time again that this is Houston, and we show up for our neighbors, and that some of our neighbors need our help. And especially in times of disaster, I've seen my team really show up. Many of them don't have power, and they came in just to support families and our students.
There are also cooling centers open across the county as the power company here says that they expect to have everyone's power restored by the end of day Wednesday. Hallie?
Priscilla Thompson live for us in Houston. Priscilla, thank you. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, the EPA warning about more and more cyber attacks on water systems and says they're getting worse. The agency says they've got to step up their protections against cyber attacks right away after 70% roughly of the systems they inspected did not meet the standards for preventing attacks. They're recommending things like changing passwords and regular assessments. Number 2, police today heading back to search the home of the suspect in those Gilgo Beach serial killings. You might remember Rex Heuermann was charged in the deaths of 4 women after their bodies were found along Gilgo Beach in Long Island. Officials would not comment on the investigation. Number 3, new research out tonight says fluoride exposure during pregnancy may be tied to behavioral problems in kids, but even the study's authors say it's too soon to stop adding fluoride to drinking water. This study found that women who had higher levels of fluoride during pregnancy reported later that their kids were more likely to have temper tantrums. Number 4, Red Lobster. Probably heard about it. Filing for bankruptcy. But if you love their cheddar biscuits, don't worry. They're planning to keep their restaurants up and running, mostly through the bankruptcy process, as they move to sell the company to a new entity. Number 5, OpenAI says it'll hit pause on one of its ChatGPT voices after some folks said it kind of sounded like Scarlett Johansson. OpenAI says they didn't mean for it to sound like her and that the voice comes from a totally different actress, but they didn't say exactly who for privacy reasons. When we come back, an online pharmacy now getting into the weight loss drug game, and it's going to cost a lot less than competitors. The FDA is suggesting that lower price could maybe come with a higher risk. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day, and because it's tough to read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. Out of our Northeast Bureau, crews in Baltimore today successfully hauling away the cargo ship that collided with the Key Bridge. It's a huge step toward reopening the Port of Baltimore. The ship had been stuck under the wreckage ever since it slammed into one of the pillars at the base of the Key Bridge in a collapse that killed 6 people nearly 2 months ago. The Dolly's 22 crew members who have had to stay on board the ship also returned to shore. Out of our Western Bureau, officials say a wildfire in Arizona burned through more than 14,000 acres. Started Saturday morning near Scottsdale. There was a lot of wind, so it tripled in size over the weekend. They've got several fire crews out there, but so far they really haven't gotten a handle on it. And out of our Western Bureau, an insect species creating big problems in northern Nevada, Mormon crickets, which get their name from nearly decimating early Utah settlers' crops. They're making a comeback after their most recent invasion last summer. Folks there say the bugs have a rotten smell, they chew away at their homes, they gather in swarms. Nevada's Ag Department tells folks to report cricket sightings to help them track and control the spread. So today, the digital pharmacy startup Hims & Hers says it'll offer weight loss drugs that are kind of like Ozempic and Wegovy. Keywords there being kind of like, because the drugs are compounded, meaning that the company's making its own version, basically. It's not the brand name versions. Hims & Hers says its drug will be a whole lot cheaper, starting at $199 a month instead of something like $1,000 plus for the brand names. And that news, wow, sent the company's stock soaring. Look at that, up 27% just today. Back in January, however, the FDA warned people not to use compounded versions of these drugs. I want to bring in Dr. Kavita Patel. As with all things with a price tag that perhaps seems too good to be true, there may be a catch. The catch being this FDA warning against compounding drugs.
Right.
If you take it, is it safe? That's the big question.
Yeah, that's the big question. So compounded drugs can offer a more affordable, as you're seeing in this case, accessible option for the drugs. But the FDA, especially with semaglutide, which is the generic kind of version that we're talking about of this compounded drug, that specifically is something that they have said, that there are bad actors out there creating compounds that might have salts and things that are not part of what kind of the original manufacturer, Novo Nordisk, intended. So it is something the FDA has cracked down on, but it's not technically illegal, and it's kind of a consumer beware situation.
But so why not, right? Why is this pharmacy allowed to make it if it's potentially not a good thing for you to take?
Exactly. So this is because we have a nationwide shortage. So there is a provision in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that allows for drugs. This is one of them. There are lots of drugs that are on these shortages lists. The FDA updates it every single day. There are hundreds of drugs where there are shortages, and in those cases, you can have a compounded version to kind of fill those shortages. We're just seeing it play out in this dramatic way, Hallie, where now you're seeing drugs like this one with weight loss, where everybody wants it. We have millions of Americans that want it.
So much attention on it,
So much attention, so much desire to get an affordable way to get this. There are employers literally going bankrupt just from these costs alone because of how many millions of dollars this drug is costing them. So Hims & Hers offering it at $200 a month sounds like a great idea, but a lot of questions remain. Once the supply gets shored up, what happens with this compounded drug? Is this compounded drug safe? It's what happens to people who need to access this a different way. $200 isn't cheap. It's not necessarily what we want to put out there. So lots of questions, but it got a lot of news today.
Sure. Do you still need a prescription for it, for a compounded drug?
You do. So this is all just like you have to have a doctor's visit. You need a prescription. And Hims & Hers has made it very clear they're working with a specific facility that has like kind of regulatory guidance. It's not like you can just pop up and make these drugs anywhere. So the FDA does have kind of a framework for that. But the rest of it is, again, just making sure that you know what you're buying.
Should also point out, it's not unusual to have compounded drugs.
It is not at all. And in fact, it can be incredibly important to have compounded drugs for people with allergies, other sorts of medications. In this particular instance, though, again, it's just making sure the FDA has put out this guidance, and we need to make sure that the drug is exactly what it was intended to be, semaglutide.
Dr. Kavita Patel, thank you for breaking that all down for us in such an easy to understand way. I appreciate it. Coming up tonight, some new moves from Target to try to take on its competitors and try to fight inflation, or at least the bite out of your wallet, what it says it'll do now with thousands of popular products. So Target's out today with this plan to try to lower prices as folks are feeling, at least, totally slammed by inflation. Target's going to cut costs on everything from butter to spinach to Clorox wipes to laundry detergent. It's coming as some other big brands are doing the same, especially Walmart, big competitor to Target, rolling back some of its prices to pre-pandemic levels. Christine Romans is here to break this all down. Are we in the midst of a big box price war, Christine?
You know, we really are, because consumers are really fed up, Hallie, and they're starting to vote with their feet, and these companies are noticing. And so you've got Target saying that it's going to cut 1,500 items right away and then roll out more over the summer. So you're going to be seeing a lot of different items that are going to be cheaper here. It's interesting. It comes on the same day that the White House actually is out slamming companies for what they say is price gouging and just not being fair and making record profits and growing their profit margins while consumers are totally tapped out. The White House in this memo saying that it's come to their attention and that all these companies should definitely start to lower prices and pass on the savings that they're seeing onto consumers. Major corporations, many seeing record profits, overcharge the American people, in some cases keeping prices elevated despite inflation falling. In this case and in a lot of other cases, we are starting to see some of these companies, they're feeling the pressure from their shoppers, right? Because they're changing how they behave and where they shop. And so you're going to see some prices rolling back.
How long does it typically take, Christine, in a moment like this for the pendulum to start to swing back? In other words, until people start to, like, unfeel the pinch?
Yeah, it's unclear. You know, a lot of the economic data would have suggested it already would have been showing up in some of these, sentiment indicators. But look, you're going to see Walmart, you're going to see other chains doing this as well. And I think as more and more companies are starting to pass on savings, maybe people will start to feel better. I know Aldi has prices back to, 2019 levels. Michael's, that company told me, the Kraft chain told me that they are lowering prices on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of items, trying to get people back. And, Target, what Target said is that they want to help you run the household and maximize your budget. That's why they're lowering prices here. Last year, Target made $8.7 billion in profit and grew its profit margins to 26% from 24%. So it's got a little wiggle room to maybe pass some of those savings on, Hallie.
All right, Christine Romans, thank you so much for staying on top of all of it. You too, appreciate it. Still to come, why the first generation to grow up on social media now says it's starting to stress them out. The answer may surprise you in tonight's original, next. So tonight's original now with in-depth reporting on a topic we've been watching. And tonight it's the pressure that Gen Z says they're facing on social media, online, feeling forced to take a position on a tough topic they may not know much about. Most recently, this popped up with the Israel-Hamas war and the protests that followed. But it's been happening well before the war started, some of these people say, with the endless scroll of influencers, opinions, ads, all of it, according to new research, taking a big toll on their psyches. Here's more Barrett.
I think I'm depressed, anxious, ADHD, or a mix of all three, said every person in Gen Z.
Gen Z is the first generation to grow up completely online, and they're starting to feel it.
We had to learn how to grow up in this different world of social media. We didn't have the rules passed down to us, and we're actually making the rules.
Corey Jane is a Gen Z poet who blew up online for her relatable poems about being a Gen Zer.
So I sit and I scroll and I rot on repeat.
Handed us our first phones in middle school. We were raised by them.
So many people in Gen Z have been struggling with the ramifications of social media, you know, like screen addiction and, you know, a imbalance of dopamine when we're dependent on constant stimulation all the time.
50% of Gen Zers spend more than an hour on social media per day, according to research from the McKinsey Health Institute. But it's not just screen addiction. The social movement's being born and spread online. I spent the afternoon on campus at University of Colorado Boulder, where people born between 1997 and 2012 told me the ever-increasing, quote, pressure to post about movements like these weighs on them almost every day.
Like there's a whole cancel culture. You get in trouble for like if you don't say anything, and then if you do and like people don't agree with you, it's like either way, like you can't win.
I feel like the anxiety is coming from people our own age. And like
Gen Z's anxiety surrounding social media is triple the levels of people their parents' age.
We're all like, I feel like impacting everyone, like each other's mental health the way that we're getting impacted too. Like it's a vicious cycle.
McKinsey's researchers note a shortage in access to behavioral health providers. Because of that, Gen Zers instead are less likely to seek care. And when they do, they rely on emergency care or turn to more social media, like following therapists on TikTok or Instagram.
If we know that there is going to be some sort of use of social media, how do we find the right way to be making it a supportive experience?
To combat the negatives, experts recommend if you're scrolling, be active on your feed rather than passive to strengthen social bonds. Turn off notifications when you're not on the apps and have a purpose every time you log on rather than just pulling up Instagram when you have a free moment.
A drug in our pocket without instructions on how or when addiction comes to stop it.
For Corey, she's reframed how she views her presence on social media.
Social media itself is neutral. It's like a neutral force, and it's kind of the user that gets to determine if it's going to have a negative or positive impact on themselves. And I think the important thing to realize when you're trying to be like, okay, real life versus social media is that whatever is in front of you, that is what's tangible.
That focused separation, an essential step to regulate mental health and scroll safely. Maura Barrett, NBC News.
Our thanks to Maura Barrett for that reporting. That's a wrap for this hour. We've got more coverage picking up right now. We're coming on the air with what some describe as grief and relief after the Iranian president was killed in a helicopter crash. We're live in the region with more on the power vacuum and what it means for a region already on edge. Plus, a stunning close to the day in former President Trump's criminal trial, why the judge cleared the courtroom after getting some major attitude from a witness. And as we've been on the air, we're learning the head of the agency that ensures our bank deposits may be stepping down after allegations of a toxic workplace. We're going to take you live to the White House. Plus, we go inside the operation that moved that container ship from under the Key Bridge in Baltimore. How this short trip's going a long way toward getting the Port of Baltimore open again. We're coming on the air with what some describe as grief and relief after the Iranian president was killed in a helicopter crash. We're live in the region with more on the power vacuum and what it means for a region already on edge. Plus, a stunning close to the day in former President Trump's criminal trial, why the judge cleared the courtroom after getting some major attitude from a witness. And as we've been on the air, we're learning the head of the agency that ensures our bank deposits may be stepping down after allegations of a toxic workplace. We're going to take you live to the White House. Plus, we go inside the operation that moved that container ship from under the Key Bridge in Baltimore. How this short trip's going a long way toward getting the Port of Baltimore open again. And Drake Bell opening up about the abuse he suffered as a teen star on Nickelodeon. That NBC News exclusive interview later on in the show. Hey, I'm Hallie, and we are starting tonight with the intense global reaction to the Iranian president's death in a helicopter crash, a mixture of what some describe as both grief and relief from people around the world. Many mourning the loss of President Ibrahim Raisi, but many others remembering him tonight as a brutal leader who oversaw executions, crackdowns. You can see here some anti-Iranian regime activists celebrating the news in London. Back here at home, the White House National Security Advisor called Raisi a man who had a lot of blood on his hands. Right now, Iran's first vice president is serving as the acting president until the new election. We're just learning that election will happen at the end of June. And right now, here's what we know, that a technical failure is being blamed for the crash of the chopper that Raisi was on. Iranian officials blaming some of the thick fog, you see it here, the bad weather, for the slow rescue response. Raisi had been traveling with a government delegation that went to Azerbaijan for a dam opening ceremony. 9 people on board, including the Iranian foreign minister, who was also killed. There are no survivors. This deadly crash leaves Iran now without 2 influential leaders at a time of international tension. So some questions tonight. How will this reverberate across the Middle East, where Iran holds influence? And what happens next in Iran, where Raisi was widely expected to take over as the country's next supreme leader? Keir Simmons is joining us now from the region. So explain this, Keir, right? Because this leadership situation now is being called a succession crisis. Raisi had been widely expected to step up in the next couple of years or so, if, in fact, there needed to happen, to become the supreme leader, essentially. Talk us through next steps and what we're seeing from worldwide reaction.
Well, Hallie, diplomats that I've spoken to here in the Gulf region are saying that their read is that Iran system is solid and that actually others will move into a position. Of course, that doesn't answer the question of what the politics will be like as a result of this. The expectation is that Iran will continue to have a hard-line leadership. Remember that Raisi was someone who crushed protests just 2 years ago for women's rights. He was someone who agreed to, was part of the launching of missiles and drones against Israel just this year, a crisis after Israel attacked Iranian position in Syria. So we don't expect changes in the short term, but you make a good point. Who is going to replace the supreme leader who is now 85 in Iran? That is a different question. It is now a bigger question, and I think it is something that even Iranians themselves don't know the answer to tonight. Another question, of course, what caused this? It does look like from those pictures, Hallie, as we have been saying, that the fog that you've seen in the rescue attempts is likely to be the responsible. It's a mountainous region there on the border with Azerbaijan. And I think that may kind of, if you like, negate a little bit any attempts to point the finger at outside forces. The US certainly being clear tonight that that it does not believe outside forces are responsible for what happened.
Keir, I'd love to know what your sort of takeaway is from this moment here, this critical moment for the international community with so much reaction around the world.
Well, this is a region where you really don't know what happens next. And I'll give you an example of that. This happened just at the end of a weekend when the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, was in Saudi Arabia and then in Israel trying to push forward with a kind of stability agreement that would gain kind of an understanding between Saudi and Israel, a new deal with America. We're not talking about that now. We're talking about the death of the Iranian president. There was also a huge eruption, division, burst out into the open between Netanyahu and a member of his war cabinet. Again, we're not talking about that. So one of the issues when we keep talking, we have so many times, haven't we, as I've stood in this region with you and talking to you about the danger of the instability here, is that you just don't know what's going to happen next and what implications it's going to have. And that's what we've seen in the past 24 hours with Iran.
Keir Simmons, we're glad to have you there in the region, live for us from Dubai tonight, covering all of it. Thank you. Back here at home, a stunning close to former President Trump's trial, at least for the day. It's not over yet, but at least for the day, this pretty extraordinary moment as the judge cleared the courtroom after getting sass from a witness. Robert Costello, given some attitude on the stand, muttering, calling it ridiculous, at one point saying, geez, to the judge, who said, nope. Everybody out. Press had to leave. So did nearly everybody else, except for Mr. Trump's entourage in the first couple rows. After what was presumably a dressing down, the judge let folks back in, and Costello, who seemed a bit chagrined at that point, carried on with his testimony. Remember, Costello was the former legal advisor for star witness Michael Cohen and has said he can prove Cohen is lying. Prosecutors are planning to pick up cross-examination of Costello tomorrow after Mr. Trump's team cross-examined Cohen himself with a whole bunch of attempts to try to chip away at Cohen's credibility. Like another extraordinary moment that happened with Cohen acknowledging he stole $30,000 from the Trump organization. Or like when Cohen said he may want to run for Congress, the defense looking to cast some doubt on his motivations, saying that Cohen may want to write a third book about the former president. The cross-examination going on for some time, with our team in the courtroom reporting the jurors seemed less than compelled, rubbing their eyes, head and hands for a bit at one point, shifting in their seats. You can see some of the testimony there. But one thing that never came up, a 2017 meeting at the Oval Office, the prosecutors say is at the heart of those 34 felony counts Mr. Trump pleaded not guilty to for allegedly falsifying business records. Now, let's talk about when this thing may wrap up. It's not going to be tomorrow. It's not going to be this week. That is because closing arguments are set for next Tuesday. That's the Tuesday after Memorial Day, meaning at this moment, TBD what happens in court the rest of this week. Possibly, the jury could get the case and begin deliberating on a verdict by next Tuesday afternoon. I want to get to Laura Jarrett, who is just inside court in just a second, but I want to start briefly outside the courthouse with Dasha Burns. In the last hour, Dasha, we've heard from Mr. Trump. Talk us through some of the late-breaking developments here in this day in court.
Well, toward the end of the day, Trump's defense attorney, Todd Blanche, argued that the case should just be dismissed at this point, especially because of Michael Cohen's testimony, saying the testimony is not worth handing over to the jury to deliberate upon because of what they laid out in their arguments, that he's a known liar, that he is an unreliable narrator, now showing to the jury that he's a thief. He stole money from the Trump organization. Not clear if the judge is buying it. He didn't say one way or the other, just said we're going to pick up court again tomorrow morning. And former President Trump certainly had some thoughts on all of this outside the courtroom. Take a listen.
But you saw what happened, what just took place in that court, and hopefully the motion to dismiss this trial will go through, because this trial is a disaster for our country.
And Hallie, you mentioned some TBD in terms of what we're going to see in court over the next couple of days. One of those big TBDs is whether or not former President Trump himself will take the stand in his own defense, Hallie.
Dasha Burns, live for us there in downtown Manhattan. Dasha, thank you. Laura, let me get to you. It is a potpourri of potential topics for discussion here. Let's pick up on what it was like inside court. You were there. Walk us through some of those moments where things got kind of spicy.
There have been so many bizarre moments in this trial, Hallie, and this one might have taken the cake. Robert Costello is sort of in this combative exchange with the judge, right? He's pushing back. He's trying to get in certain lines that he wants to get in about Michael Cohen. And the judge is basically telling him to stick to the script, but he didn't. And so he starts muttering under his breath when some of the prosecutor's objections were sustained. He starts saying things like ridiculous and geez. At one point, the judge finally stops and says, you know what, ladies and gentlemen, you go out for a minute. The courtroom is cleared, as I should say, the jury is cleared out. And then he lays into Costello. At one point, the judge is saying to him, are you staring me down? And it got to such a boiling point, Hallie, that the judge then clears the courtroom. But the only hitch there is that Trump's surrogates, that you mentioned at the top, they were allowed to stay while the press, our media lawyer, and other members of the public were cleared from the courtroom. So we don't know exactly what then continued to transpire between the judge and Costello, but you can imagine it continued to be heated. We were only out of the rooms for maybe less than 5 minutes, but the public has a right to cover this trial. The press has a right to be there. And so it was really bizarre to have everybody cleared out in that moment.
It's also like, as you say, so many extraordinary moments. And one of them today came as prosecutors, or the defense, I should say, was going after Michael Cohen's credibility, elicited this acknowledgement that he stole money from the Trump organization, as he said. And yet, the defense never asked about this really critical 2017 Oval Office meeting. Perhaps for obvious reasons, they don't want to hand the prosecution a home run, Laura. But there's so much around Michael Cohen that came up that did not get to the heart of these 34 counts of falsification of business records that the former president is charged with.
Yeah, we spent so much time on the cross-examination of Michael Cohen as the defense tried to undermine his credibility, tried to point out all the reasons he might have a motivation to lie. But we spent very little time on Cohen's testimony as it relates to calls and meetings that he says he had with the former president. He says he has a very specific recollection of a certain call, as you mentioned, that happens after Trump is already president, right? So after he's already president, after the hush money has been paid, Cohen says he meets with him in the Oval, and they talk about how Cohen's going to be reimbursed. The prosecutors say that's key because it shows Mr. Trump's knowledge, which he has denied, having any advanced knowledge of both the Daniels payment and how the restructuring gets done. Yet we didn't hear a peep from that on his cross-examination. So I'm interested to see what both sides do with that in closing arguments, because if it doesn't come out during the actual testimony, then you're really limited in what you can say in closings.
So speaking of closings, next Tuesday, that means no verdict until, what, mid-late next week at the earliest?
Yeah, at the earliest. And part of the delay here is there was some dispute over whether the defense was even going to put on a case at all. We weren't sure they were going to call Bob Costello. It now looks like that's probably their last witness, so a pretty limited defense case here, Hallie. But there's going to be a big fight tomorrow about jury instructions. It may seem dry and mundane, but it's so important in a case like this that's so legally complicated. I would imagine we could be here all day just fighting about jury instructions. And then, of course, we don't have court on Wednesdays. We don't have court on Friday before Memorial Day. And so the judge didn't want there to be a long gap between when the jury is charged and when they start deliberating. So that's why he decided, let's just table everything after the charging conference on jury instructions and do the closing arguments on Tuesday, and then we can have the jury get charged, and then they can start deliberating.
So not to get into speculation land here, Laura, but if you think tomorrow is going to be all about jury instructions, that would assume that former President Trump does not testify on his own behalf and does not subject himself to a potentially very damning cross-examination by the prosecution. I know a lot of legal experts think it would be a huge mistake if Donald Trump testified. And yet I spoke to two of his former attorneys who are like, hey, you never know.
Well, look, there's always a long shot, and I never want to say never, but as of right now, it doesn't look like he's going to testify. If he's going to testify, he obviously opens himself up to a massive cross-examination, in which case the timeline that I just walked through with you is all shot to pieces.
All right, very good. Laura Jarrett, we're so glad to have you. Thank you. We'll talk to you, I'm sure, again tomorrow. Appreciate it, friend. We got some more breaking news for you here in Washington in just the last couple of minutes. The head of the FDIC, that's the agency that ensures the money you have in the bank, announcing he is set to step down after a scathing report detailed a toxic culture of sex harassment and discrimination. Chairman Martin Gruenberg saying in a statement he will resign once his successor is confirmed. That announcement coming just hours after the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee called on President Biden to replace Gruenberg. Kelly O'Donnell is following these latest developments from the White House. And Kelly, this is maybe not an agency that is as accessible to people as, let's say, the Defense Department or the State Department. It is still serving a critical function, right, for a lot of people and their money. Talk us through what is happening here as you're following these late-breaking developments.
Good to be with you, Hallie. And anyone with a bank account does have a connection to the FDIC.
That's right.
And this is a surprise in the sense of the timing of it, but it has been building because of criticism of the culture of the workplace at the FDIC. And the report that has been cited in this does not specifically fault Martin Gruenberg for the conduct, but does say, as the head of the department and a longtime employee, in effect, that he is ultimately responsible. And so he is saying that he will step down with a successor named and confirmed. And we know the environment in the Senate. The White House today acknowledging that this is a separate and independent agency. It's not the same kind of appointment we see for other kinds of posts in the government. But they are saying in a statement that it is important for the president to have a chance to look at this as I mentioned, an independent agency. And the president will, of course, expect the administration to reflect the values of decency and integrity and to protect the rights and dignity of all employees. So that is a signal to this report that has found sexual harassment and so forth in the workplace. Now, why this becomes more complicated is because the FDIC agency is bipartisan, and if a Democrat leaves the position, then it is the vice chair, who happens to be a Republican, would be, in effect, in charge of the policy going forward for a period of time. So it is politically a little bit iffy for the administration. And it was notable that Sherrod Brown, Senate Democrat from Ohio, who's up for re-election, ultimately called for Gruenberg to step down. And so the political pressure is all around on this, given what we've seen in the last several years about conduct in the workplace. Hallie?
Kelly O'Donnell live for us on the North Lawn. Kelly, thank you for walking us through it. Let's take you to the middle of the country now, where millions of people are in the path of some pretty intense storms. We've already seen tornadoes and hail slamming states like Oklahoma and Kansas. You see how dark the sky is there. Power got knocked out, trees came down, search and rescue operations happened on the ground. At least 2 people were hurt, according to officials. And you can see the damage to houses, even the roof of a local firehouse totally blown off. All in all, this is 4 straight days of storms from the plains to the East Coast this week, as another part of the country scrambles to recover from a system we told you about last week, with 200,000 people still in the dark in Texas. Priscilla Thompson is on the ground in Houston. Meteorologist Bill Cairns is standing by. Priscilla, to you first, because with 200,000 people roughly without power and a dangerous heat wave already starting to hit, it could not come at potentially a worst possible moment.
Yeah, Hallie, it was in the 80s and the 90s all weekend. We're now on day 4 without power, and it is 90 degrees out here right now again. And that is what the entire week is going to look like. So across the county, we've seen cooling centers opening. There have been a number of distributions for ice, water, food. We were at one of those earlier today that was run by the school district looking to get students and their families some resources. And they had enough supplies for 500 families and ran out in less than 2 hours. That line was wrapped around the block. I asked the organizer of that drive what message that sent to her and what it meant to sort of see this community coming together during this moment. And I want to play a little bit of what she had to say.
I think that this experience really shows us time and time again that this is Houston and we show up for our neighbors and that some of our neighbors need our help. And especially in times of disaster, I've seen my team really show up. Many of them don't have power, and they came in just to support families and our students.
And so folks continuing to show up for one another as they work to get through this. We know that there are still dozens of schools that are closed. And in fact, earlier today, Houston ISD had sent some students to school and had to end up dismissing them early because the air conditions went out. So there are still a lot of infrastructure and logistical issues here. But the good news is that the power company does believe that they're going to have everyone's power restored by end of day Wednesday. But that is still 2 more days for folks who are dealing with this 80 and 90 degree heat. Hallie?
Priscilla Thompson live for us there in the heat in Houston. Priscilla, thank you. Bill Cairns, I want to turn to you now. Where's the biggest risk moving forward?
Tomorrow is probably going to be an outbreak, Hallie. We're going to have probably thousands of people without power, possibly tornadoes. Today, we're going to have isolated severe storms, and they'll continue through the night. We do have a thunderstorm watch up for areas of Michigan. These storms have crossed Lake Michigan, and now they're heading toward Kalamazoo and also to Grand Rapids. Wind gusts and small hail, kind of like your typical strong thunderstorms you'd get in the summertime. I don't expect anything major. Later tonight, more towards areas of Iowa and Nebraska, a little corner here of Colorado. Big thunderstorms are going to erupt in about a couple hours from now, and they're going to continue right through the night through Nebraska. So it's going to be keeping a lot of people up, and we could see wind gusts that could be in excess of hurricane force, this area where you see the stripes here, including North Platte and Kearney. Now, as we go towards tomorrow, anytime you see our map here, you get the bright red bullseye in the middle of it. That's when you know we're in for a bad severe weather event. This is what we call level 4 of 5, a moderate risk. In this area here from southern Wisconsin, Iowa, northern Illinois, northern half of Missouri, we could deal with tornadoes and the possibility of additional strong tornadoes. The best chance of a strong tornado tomorrow is in the hatched lines, Des Moines, Quad Cities, up to Dubuque, Madison, all the way to Peoria to Kirksville. And so make sure now you have your family plan in place, because tomorrow afternoon at this time we'll likely be tracking maybe a few tornadoes in this region, and maybe 1 or 2 of them could what we call strong to violent tornadoes. By the time we get to Wednesday, straight line winds more of a problem, isolated tornadoes. That's going to go from Ohio all the way down to Dallas. That's a huge area. This is going to be a straight line that's going to roll through this region. And on top of all that, Hallie, we may have to deal with some flash flooding, too, especially here in areas of Minnesota. So another violent week. I know we'd all like to wrap this up and end it, but it just doesn't seem like it wants to.
And there's so many people who are just hoping for some relief. Bill Cairns, I have a feeling we'll be talking again tomorrow. I hope not, but it sounds like it. Thanks, friend. Appreciate it. To another major headline just breaking in the last couple of minutes here. After the head of the ICC announced he's looking to charge both Israeli and Hamas leaders with war crimes and crimes against humanity, President Biden now says what's happening in Gaza is not genocide. I want you to listen to this.
Let me be clear. Contrary to allegations against Israel made by the International Court of Justice, what's happening is not genocide.
It is an extraordinary move for the ICC to bring charges against a U.S. ally. The chief prosecutor, again, making this announcement for the ICC. It comes as the former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien says that he and 2 other allies of former President Donald Trump are visiting Israel, where they've met with a top government official, including the prime minister, his rival Benny Gantz. The Israeli prime minister calling the ICC decision absurd. Raf Sanchez has more.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today furiously denouncing the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, who is accusing him of war crimes and seeking a warrant for his arrest. The prosecutor also looking to arrest Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, as well as the 3 top leaders of Hamas's military and political wings. The prosecutor accusing Israel of deliberately starving Palestinian civilians in Gaza by choking off supplies of food, and also of, in some cases, deliberately targeting civilian populations. Prime Minister Netanyahu, in a statement, saying, "I reject with disgust the Hague prosecutor's comparison between democratic Israel and the mass murderers of Hamas. This is a complete distortion of reality." President Biden calling the prosecutor's allegations outrageous and saying the United States will not accept any comparison between Israel and Hamas. Now, the prosecutor of the ICC also accusing senior Hamas leaders of atrocities on October 7th and beyond, including murder, torture, rape, and hostage taking. The Israeli government says there are still 128 hostages, living and dead, being held by Hamas inside of Gaza. In a statement tonight, Hamas is applauding the ICC prosecutor's decision to move against Israeli leaders, but is denying that they committed war crimes themselves. In terms of the legal process here, it is now up to a 3-judge panel at the ICC to decide whether to issue these arrest warrants or not. If they do, Prime Minister Netanyahu unlikely to face immediate arrest, but it becomes very risky for him to travel to any of the 124 countries that are signatories to the court. That includes most nations in Western Europe. And the Prime Minister would be joining an unwelcome club alongside Vladimir Putin of world leaders accused of crimes against humanity. Back to you.
Our thanks to Raf Sanchez for that reporting. Lots more to come here on the show, including 3 Americans allegedly caught up in a coup attempt in the Congo. What the U.S. is saying about all of it tonight. And Red Lobster officially filing for bankruptcy. The all-you-can-eat reason why. Rock bottom Red Lobster. Panera's super caffeinated lemonade has the restaurant chain in hot water yet again. That's in the 5 things. But first, overseas, at least 3 Americans have been arrested, accused of being involved in an attempted coup in the Democratic Republic of Congo, according to the military there. One of the Americans is the attempted coup leader's son. 6 people were killed. Something like 50 other people were arrested. It all happened after a gunfight in the country's capital at the presidential palace. David Noriega is following this one and joining us now. What do we know? Were Americans really involved in this? Who are they?
Yeah, Hallie, so the details are still pretty sketchy, but what we know is what we're hearing from the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo. So they say that this attempted coup was orchestrated by a guy named Christian Malanga. He is a Congolese politician, opposition politician, who's been based in the United States for many years. From here in the United States, he at one point proclaimed himself the rightful president in exile of the DRC, or as he called it, Zaire, which is an old name for the DRC. What the authorities in the DRC are saying is that 3 Americans were arrested in the aftermath of this attempted coup. Malanga, the leader himself, they say, was shot dead. One of the Americans who was arrested, as you pointed out, is his son. Another was identified by DRC authorities as Benjamin Zalman Polen. We know very little about him other than that he's been described in the press as a cannabis entrepreneur, and he has one old marijuana conviction, according to court records here in the United States. The identity of the 3rd American arrested is unknown. There are a lot of questions around this attempted coup. One of the main ones is, how did this unit manage to penetrate government buildings, including the presidential palace? The president himself was not there at the time, but is embattled for a number of reasons. This coup, this attempted coup, just adds to the list. Hallie?
What has the U.S. government said about this?
Yeah, not very much. The U.S. ambassador to the DRC did put out a statement, pretty resoundingly distancing the U.S. from these 3 Americans, saying that they are fully cooperating with the government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo in their criminal investigation, and saying that they will help the DRC hold any Americans accountable for criminal acts. For now, that's it. Hallie?
David Noriega live for us there, tracking all of those developments. Thank you. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, the EPA now warning about more and more cyber attacks on water systems and that they're getting worse. The agency says these places have to step up protections against cyber attacks ASAP after 70% of the systems they inspected did not meet the standards for preventing attacks. They're recommending things like changing passwords. Number 2, an NBC News exclusive today, another lawsuit filed against Panera over its super caffeinated charged lemonade. The suit says a teenager in Pennsylvania went into cardiac arrest after drinking it and had to be resuscitated. That comes a couple of weeks after Panera said it will discontinue the drink. The company did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Number 3, a man tied to European royalty has disappeared around Malibu, according to police, last seen Saturday. He's the stepfather of Greece's Princess Tatiana. Police say there's some concern for his well-being. They want anyone with information to give him a call. Number 4, Red Lobster filing for bankruptcy today. But if you love their cheddar biscuits, no worries. A lot of its restaurants will stay up and running mostly through the bankruptcy process. Red Lobster is trying to sell off to a new entity. Number 5, OpenAI says it'll hit pause on one of its ChatGPT voices, the voice that a lot of people thought sounded like Scarlett Johansson. OpenAI says it's not supposed to sound like her, that the voice comes from a totally different actress, but they wouldn't say exactly who for privacy. There's some incredible video coming in today of that ship that crashed into the Key Bridge in Baltimore. It has finally been floated away from the wreckage. Check this out, a time lapse showing a bunch of tugboats pulling the cargo ship Dateline away from the bridge toward a pier. Obviously, we sped it up just a bit because it's super slow. Took hours to do this, of course. It's about 2 months after the shocking collapse. You're seeing it here, deadly as well. When the Dateline lost power and hit the Francis Scott Key Bridge, 6 people were killed, 6 workers who were trying to do some road repairs at the time of the collapse. The ship went dark before slamming into the bridge, creating what you just saw there. The ship's been kind of sitting there since. Its crew of 21 people on board the whole time. Tom Costello has the latest.
Yeah, hey, Hallie, so this was a successful operation. Finally, after 2 months, the Dateline container ship no longer stuck under the wreckage of the Key Bridge that it crashed into early in the morning 2 months ago, killing 6 highway workers who were on the bridge at the time. The bodies of those who lost their lives have been recovered from the water and returned to their families, some of them in Central America. The operation to move the Dateline actually got underway at about 6:40 a.m. this morning when the Patapsco River was near high tide, and that allowed the Dateline to float. Preparing for this operation actually started last week when demolition teams used explosives to break apart massive chunks of this collapsed steel from the bridge that were still weighing down on the ship. It had been stuck on the river bottom, as we said, for 2 months, and it is a huge ship, the size of 3 football fields, weighing about 95,000 gross tons. Yesterday, crews released all the anchors and the lines and began pumping more than 1 million gallons of water out of the ballast tanks. So that allowed 5 tugboats to move into position this morning, starting a delicate operation to push and pull the Dateline 2.5 miles to the local marine terminal. It all seemed to go very, very smoothly. Now, interestingly, the crew of the Dateline has not been able to leave the ship ever since it crashed into the bridge. 21 crew members from India and Sri Lanka have stayed on during the entire salvage operation, even the controlled explosions. The ship was actually headed for Sri Lanka when it hit the bridge, but the crew members' visas have now expired, and the FBI has taken their cell phones, part of this ongoing criminal investigation. And maritime law also states that the ship does need to be manned at all times. So it's not at all clear whether those crew members will be allowed to leave the ship and fly home anytime soon, or if they'll stay on board as investigators and salvage teams continue to work on the ship. But what they know about the timeline could be critical. The NTSB says that the Dali experienced a power failure just 10 hours before the crash and before it had even left the port. So the question is whether the crew knew that it had power problems and yet left the port anyway before crashing into the bridge. And if so, that could be a criminal offense and open the ship operator to make it liable for the costs of the disaster. The Key Bridge was used by 30,000 commuters a day before the disaster, so it's had a big impact on workers in the area who needed it to get from point A to point B, but also, of course, on the impact on the Port of Baltimore itself has been significant. It is a crucial part of the Maryland and the East Coast economy, handling cargo traffic into and out of the region. Maryland Governor Wes Moore said on Meet the Press on Sunday that the plan to fully reopen this federal channel by the end of the month remains on schedule. Rebuilding the bridge itself is expected to cost about $2 billion and take 4 years at least. They hope to identify a lead contractor for the job later this summer. And meantime, the Dali is expected to eventually head to Norfolk for permanent repairs, maybe in the next few months. Hallie?
Our thanks to Tom Costello for that reporting. Lots to cover there. Coming up here on the show, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange set to make a last-ditch push to avoid extradition. A dog-friendly surfing competition out of Spain giving the Olympics a run for their money. You got to see this in the Global. NBC News covers hundreds of international stories every day, and because it can be tough to read or watch or listen to them all, our teams around the world have done it for you. Here's a look at what they're watching in a segment we call The Global. Out of the United Kingdom, Julian Assange winning the right to appeal his extradition to the U.S. You can see supporters of the WikiLeaks founder cheering outside court in London today. Remember, Assange is facing spying charges in this country for leaking classified documents. His lawyer argues Assange might be discriminated against because he's a foreign national. Maybe months before this appeal is actually heard. Out of Japan, tourists visiting Mount Fuji now have to make reservations and pay $18 to climb one of the most popular trails. That's because Japan's trying to get a handle on over-tourism, on littering, on people attempting to bullet climb what they call the mountain, which puts some other climbers at risk. And out of Spain, check it out, dogs shredding, hanging 10 in this surfing contest over the weekend, hanging 20, I guess. I don't know how that works. It happens every year in northern Spain. Its aim is to encourage dog adoptions, showing some new ways to bond with your pup. So today, the digital pharmacy startup Hims & Hers says it'll offer weight loss drugs that are similar to Ozempic and Wegovy. Keyword there, similar to. These drugs are compounded, meaning it's not the company's own version of the drugs, or it is, rather, it's not the brand names, it's their own compounded version. Hims & Hers says its version will be a lot cheaper, about $199 a month instead of something like $1,000 plus for the brand names. Stock went way up on that news today, up 27%, even though back in January, the FDA warned people not to use compounded versions of these drugs. Let's bring in Dr. Kavita Patel. As with all things with a price tag that perhaps seems too good to be true, there may be a catch. The catch being this FDA warning against compounding drugs.
Right.
If you take it, is it safe? That's the big question.
Yeah, that's the big question. So compounded drugs can offer a more affordable, as you're seeing in this case, accessible option for the drugs. But the FDA, especially with semaglutide, which is the generic kind of version that we're talking about of this compounded drug, that specifically is something that they have said, that there are bad actors out there creating compounds that might have salts and things that are not part of what kind of the original manufacturer, Novo Nordisk, intended. So it is something the FDA has cracked down on, but it's not technically illegal, and it's kind of a consumer beware situation.
But so why not, right? Why is this pharmacy allowed to make it if it's potentially not a good thing for you to take?
Exactly. So this is because we have a nationwide shortage. So there is a provision in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that allows for drugs. This is one of them. There are lots of drugs that are on these shortages lists. The FDA updates it every single day. There are hundreds of drugs where there are shortages, and in those cases, you can have a compounded version to kind of fill those shortages. We're just seeing it play out in this dramatic way, Hallie, where now you're seeing drugs like this one with weight loss, where everybody wants it. We have millions of Americans that want it.
So much attention on it,
so much attention, so much desire to get an affordable way to get this. There are employers literally going bankrupt just from from these costs alone because of how many millions of dollars this drug is costing them. So Hims and Hers offering it at $200 a month sounds like a great idea, but a lot of questions remain. Once the supply gets shored up, what happens with this compounded drug? Is this compounded drug safe? What happens to people who need to access this a different way? $200 isn't cheap. It's not necessarily what we want to put out there. So lots of questions, but it got a lot of news today.
Sure. You still need a prescription for it, for a compounded drug?
You do. So this is all just like you have to have a doctor's visit. You need a prescription. And Hims and Hers has made it very clear they're working with a specific facility that has like kind of regulatory guidance. It's not like you can just pop up and make these drugs anywhere. So the FDA does have kind of a framework for that. But the rest of it is, again, just making sure that you know what you're buying.
Should also point out, it's not unusual to have compounded drugs.
It is not at all. And in fact, it can be incredibly important to have compounded drugs for people with allergies, other sorts of medications. In this particular instance, though, again, it's just making sure the FDA has put out this guidance, and we need to make sure that the drug is exactly what it was intended to be, semaglutide.
Dr. Kavita Patel, thank you for breaking that all down for us in such an easy to understand way. I appreciate it. Coming up tonight, some new moves from Target to try to take on its competitors and try to fight inflation, or at least the bite out of your wallet, what it says it'll do now with thousands of popular products. So Target's out today with this plan to try to lower prices as folks are feeling, at least, totally slammed by inflation. Target's going to cut costs on everything from butter to spinach to Clorox wipes to laundry detergent. It's coming as some other big brands are doing the same, especially Walmart, big competitor to Target, rolling back some of its prices to pre-pandemic levels. Christine Romans is here to break this all down. Are we in the midst of a big box price war, Christine?
You know, we really are, because consumers are really fed up, Hallie, and they're starting to vote with their feet, and these companies are noticing. And so you've got Target saying that it's going to cut 1,500 items right away and then roll out more over the summer. So you're going to be seeing a lot of different items that are going to be cheaper here. It's interesting. It comes on the same day that the White House actually is out slamming companies for what they say is price gouging and just not being fair and making record profits and growing their profit margins while consumers are totally tapped out. The White House in this memo saying that it's come to their attention and that all these companies should definitely start to lower prices and pass on the savings that they're seeing onto consumers. Major corporations, many seeing record profits, overcharge the American people, in some cases keeping prices elevated despite inflation falling. In this case and in a lot of other cases, we are starting to see some of these companies, they're feeling the pressure from their shoppers, right? Because they're changing how they behave and where they shop. And so you're going to see some prices rolling back.
How long does it typically take, Christine, in a moment like this for the pendulum to start to swing back? In other words, until people start to, like, unfeel the pinch?
Yeah, it's unclear. You know, a lot of the economic data would have suggested it already would have been showing up in some of these, sentiment indicators. But look, you're going to see Walmart, you're going to see other chains doing this as well. And I think as more and more companies are starting to pass on savings, maybe people will start to feel better. I know Aldi has prices back to, 2019 levels. Michael's, that company told me, the Kraft chain told me that they are lowering prices on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of items, trying to get people back. And Target, what Target said they want to help you run the household and maximize your budget. That's why they're lowering prices here. You know, last year, Target made $8.7 billion in profit and grew its profit margins to 26% from 24%. So it's got a little wiggle room to maybe pass some of those savings on, Hallie.
All right, Christine Romans, thank you so much for staying on top of all of it. You too, appreciate it. Still to come, why the first generation to grow up on social media now says it's starting to stress them out. The answer may surprise you in tonight's original, next. To tonight's original now with in-depth reporting on a topic we've been watching. And tonight it's the pressure that Gen Z says they're facing on social media, online, feeling forced to take a position on a tough topic they may not know much about. Most recently, this popped up with the Israel-Hamas war and the protests that followed. But it's been happening well before the war started, some of these people say, with the endless scroll of influencers, opinions, ads, all of it, according to new research, taking a big toll on their psyches. Here's Maura Barrett.
I think I'm depressed, anxious, ADHD, or a mix of all three, said every person in Gen Z.
Gen Z is the first generation to grow up completely online, and they're starting to feel it.
We had to learn how to grow up in this different world of social media. We didn't have the rules passed down to us, and we're actually making the rules.
Corey Jane is a Gen Z poet who blew up online for her relatable poems about being a Gen Zer.
So I sit and I scroll and I rot on repeat. Handed us our first phones in middle school. We were raised by them.
You know, so many people in Gen Z have been struggling with the ramifications of social media, you know, like screen addiction and, you know, a imbalance of dopamine when we're dependent on constant stimulation all the time.
50% of Gen Zers spend more than an hour on social media per day, according to research from the McKinsey Health Institute. But it's not just screen addiction, with social movements being born and spread online. I spent the afternoon on campus at University of Colorado Boulder, where people born between 1997 and 2012 told me the ever-increasing, quote, pressure to post about movements like these weighs on them almost every day.
Like there's the whole cancel culture. You get in trouble for like if you don't say anything, and then if you do, and like people don't agree with you, it's like either way, like you can't win.
I feel like the anxiety is coming from people our own age, and like
Gen Z's anxiety surrounding social media is triple the levels of people their parents' age.
we're all like, I feel like impacting everyone, like each other's mental health the way that we're getting impacted too. Like it's a vicious cycle.
McKinsey's researchers note a shortage in access to behavioral health providers. Because of that, Gen Zers instead are less likely to seek care. And when they do, they rely on emergency care or turn to more social media, like following therapists on TikTok or Instagram.
If we know that there is going to be some sort of use of social media, how do we find the right way to be making it a supportive experience?
To combat the negatives, experts recommend if you're scrolling, be active on your feed rather than passive to strengthen social bonds. Turn off notifications when you're not on the apps and have a purpose every time you log on rather than just pulling up Instagram when you have a free moment.
A drug in our pocket without instructions on how or when addiction comes to stop it.
For Corey, she's reframed how she views her presence on social media.
Social media itself is neutral. It's like a neutral force, and it's kind of the user that gets to determine if it's going to have a negative or positive impact on themselves. And I think the important thing to realize when you're trying to be like, okay, real life versus social media is that whatever is in front of you, that is what's tangible.
That focused separation, an essential step to regulate mental health and scroll safely. Maura Barrett, NBC News.
Our thanks to Maura Barrett for that reporting. That's a wrap for this hour. We've got more coverage picking up right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.